večer svima, hvala što ste došli. Veliko mi je zadovoljstvo najaviti našeg večerašnjeg gosta, Vladimira Ryzhkovskog. Hvala ti, Vladimir, što si prihvatio naš poziv. Ovo je drugo u seriji predavanja Povijest, umjetnosti i društva. I negdje smo prošli petak sa Sanjom, otvorili to neko važno mjesto sjećanja, spomenika, obilježavanja nekog socijalnog prostora. Pa djelomično će se Vladimir malo iz svoje perspektive nadovezati na tu temu. Ja ću te ukratko predstaviti. Znači, Vladimir je rođen u Užgorodu, u Ukrajini, već neko vrijeme sa zagrebačkom adresom, živi u Zagrebu. Studirao je rusku, sovjetsku i istočno-evropsku povijest u Ukrajini, Rusiji i SAD-u. Vladimir je doktorirao na sveučilištu Georgetown u Americi, a u svom istraživačkom radu bavi se istraživanjem analitičkih potencijala i primjenjivosti postkolonijalne teorije na rusku imperijalnu i sovjetsku povijest. Ovo je naslov današnjeg predavanja i jako sam uzbuđena, Vladimir, da ćeš podijeliti neke važne i teoretske i neke inpute koje si stekao radeći na svom doktoratu, bavići se temom ruskog okcidentalizma. Predavanje će sad biti na engleskom, ali mislim da ćemo malo miksati isto jezike.
Hvala svima što ste došli. Hvala naravno Ani na pozivu i na mogućnosti da predstavim otprilike neko dio svog rada. Ispričavam se naravno da ne mogu pričati na hrvatskom, zato što nisam još na toj razini da držim predavanja na hrvatskom, neko akademsko. Ali naravno da Q&A session pitanja možete postavljati na hrvatskom. Sad switcham na engleski. So I'm coming from the academic background, spending much of my life in the ivory tower of the academia. And I'm trained to present talks very clear cut. I mean, I'm making my argument, I'm identifying the historiographical gap, and identifying the methodological stakes in my disciplinary field. And that is why it was very unexpected for me that Anna suggested me to talk more from my personal perspective, a little bit to push to the background these academic concerns that I have about my work. And it was both challenging and intriguing because in the last couple of years I clearly, my focus shift toward this reflection on the issue of tension in my own work between experience and specific academic perspective, something that clearly, as I realized, going back retrospectively, related to the tumultuous political context in my homeland. In Ukraine, Euromaidan, the war that followed, and civic conflict, it profoundly shaped my interest and my own engagement with postcolonial theory, which I never thought I ever do in my work. So definitely this tension between experience and intellectual perspective was very important. And here the title of the talk, where it's coming. It's coming from Nabokov, his famous autobiographical novel, Speak Memory. And Nabokov has a very strong position in this regard. He thought that individual memory can deliver some authenticity that breaks through this straitjacket of the political context. And unfortunately, I cannot say that about myself, and on the contrary, I'm fully realizing now to what a degree different positions that I occupied previously, before, let's say, 2013 as a clear watershed, both in my personal and academic trajectory, so Ukrainian, Euromaidan. It was defined by multiple discourses and generally defined by the broader context, political context in my country, a little bit mollified by specificity of my trajectory, since I was constantly moving back and forth between Ukraine, living in Russia, then moving to the United States. That helped me to keep some distance, but still, I clearly can identify that turn towards postcolonialism, attempt to adjust the application of the theory towards Russian history, Soviet history, Ukrainian history, was closely connected to my own drifting, political and ideological, during these events, drifting toward the left, since I was now identifying myself with any leftist option in Ukraine before 2013, and just exigencies of the moment, they forced me to reconsider that. And I think at the present moment, that question that I will pose today as well, a little bit from personal perspective, a little bit from more academic, historiographical point of view. It's really urgent, the question of inheriting the socialist legacy in Ukraine, but particularly at the present moment in Ukraine, it's very, very urgent. Because it's a local context, definitely I'm talking from the local perspective. And the legacy of the 20th century communism is clearly one of the most important things for anyone who's trying to build some left alternative in the global context. But at the same time, so this local Ukrainian concerns that I have, it's practically very important to grapple with the past and come to terms with the past, particularly the socialist past, which is almost legally banned in Ukraine at the present moment. It's very difficult to talk about that. At the same time, the recent developments related to Black Lives Matter movement, I realized to what degree my agenda, academic agenda, and my concerns, Ukrainian concerns, really resonate with some questions and challenges that the global transnational left is now facing all around the world. So that is why I decided a little bit to adjust my talk. It's going to triangulate these three elements. I will start with Black Lives Matter movement globally, the repercussions of American events in Europe, particularly in Central European context. Then I move towards some Ukrainian issues and Ukrainian responses to what happened in the US two months ago and in Europe. And eventually I will provide somehow this historical perspective on what's happening now in Ukraine, what's happening now in Europe, trying to show the potential of applying post-colonial theory and generally post-colonial agenda, which, as I already mentioned, is very, very urgent, both politically and intellectually. And bring finally home the major point, because the Central European context is definitely, given the audience to which I'm talking, it's quite important for me. And I think that what I will be telling you about Ukraine will definitely resonate something, and we clearly have a common ground. Ukrainian-Croatian context. There are multiple parallels, and I don't think that it will be very difficult for you to understand what I'm going to talk about. So let's start first with Black Lives Matter. In the US, as you know probably, the movement and the major components of the current crisis, they were already in place well before 2020, and the killing of the George Floyd. Already in 2014, 2015, there are riots, let's say in Ferguson, Missouri, 2014, Michael Brown. The National Guard is called in. The conflicts around the Confederate monuments is already going back to 2015, Charleston shootings, and eventually the conflict and clashes in Charleston in 2017. I think everyone heard about it. But what is really specific for the present moment, it's global repercussions that particular events in the US have. And I clearly thinking here about European context, because the repercussions there are particularly interesting. So the most interesting way in which American crisis basically affected European affairs definitely is related to politics of memory. There is certain ideological consensus that already consolidated in Europe, let's say, from the late 80s, early 20s. I just will remind you in which way this American events challenging this consensus, which is deeply ingrained in the institutional European context. So foundations of European Union was to a certain degree reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and memorial foundation for development of this project, and definitely development of the neoliberal consensus in 1990s, was defined by two factors. It's memory about Nazis and Holocaust, which help in 1990s, so taking responsibility for the Holocaust and admitting the guilt was a way to show that this right alternative is completely ruled out and untenable. But at the same time, the second pillar of the European politics of memory was clearly anti-communism. And after 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and just realization that there is the end of history arrived. There is no alternative on the left, and these were two pillars of the construction of memory, political memory in the European Union. Already some problems arrived in 2004 when the new member state came, which member state from Central European and Eastern Europe. They were quite happy with admitting anti-communism because that was basically the consensus and agenda in these countries. But we're not ready to admit the guilt for collaboration during the Second World War, and definitely their contribution to the Holocaust. So already were some questions, but what's happening now, and I think the way in which these American events affecting and hitting basically the construction of this political memory in Europe is that it going to the core basically of national memory, of national history, which most Europeans were not ready to discuss openly 10 years ago and 5 years ago. And I think this statue of Churchill is clearly identifying that specific context, coronavirus, the migrant crisis, everything caused in this particular moment, which helped to challenge and really reconsider the past, colonial and imperialist past, which it turns out was quite important for the foundations of the First World modernity, let's say. And the key fighter against Nazism and communism, so these two pillars that I was talking about, Churchill, is now painted as a racist and needs to be erased from the national memory. This is a real challenge for the establishment, and at the same time, the conflict around statues and toppling statues, considering this imperial and colonial past European, is strengthening the ideological dispositions that we have. Right and left, the polarization that is really, really evident in the last couple of years. These events, they basically producing and solidifying the existing fault lines, political fault lines. I just put here a quotation from the member of the Fidesz party, so this conservative rightist Hungarian party, and it's interesting how, while reacting to the questions about Black Lives Matter, he immediately turned attention that that's inappropriate. Something like that already happened in Central and Eastern Europe during communist dictatorships. They didn't allow us to talk about our past in the same way that leftists, that is implication of his idea, not allowing to celebrate the heroes of national history in Europe. Clearly, the left mobilized, and Black Lives Matter movement mobilized the left all around Europe, and I think some of you probably participated as well in the protests that happened with quite similar agenda, either Budapest, Warsaw, or in Zagreb or in Prague. There was need for the left to come out and just protest and express solidarity with similar agenda. It's a question of migrants and migrant crisis that still is shattering basically politically Europe. And at the same time, looking back and pointing to some problematic aspects of the past in each of these countries, related to ethnic othering, related to some complex issues going back to the period of Second World War. For the left, at the same time, definitely this protests give opportunity to reach back to the past. And to underscore the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial aspects of communist project in the 20th century. Clearly, this picture is Soviet poster from 1970s supporting the liberation in Angola. And Soviets were supporting the war, national liberation movement there. Or, closer to home, definitely reclaiming the past struggles, in this case, the Yugoslav partisans, allows people really to mobilize themselves emotionally and to reconnect the past struggles with the present struggle that's happening right at the moment. More than that, you probably, some of you heard about this, that even after the reckoning with the communist legacy after 1989, when all Lenin statues, Marx statues, at least in Central Eastern Europe, were removed, toppled down, eventually there is an attempt to reclaim even that part of the communist legacy, and this statue of Lenin was 2 weeks ago erected in Gelsenkirchen in Germany, with quotation that I put here. So it's time to celebrate our own heroes, definitely. So this symmetrical mobilization, ideological happening in the left. And so I decided to put just how these differences, ideological, conceptual, they basically neatly put into boxes. There is nationalism, definitely that's the major issue in Central and Eastern Europe, which is opposed to socialism, and then you have different attributes, which in the same manner can be attributed to your opponents on the right. And I think that specific Ukrainian repercussions of it, I will now move to Ukrainian context, and reception of the Black Lives Movement in Ukraine helps to shed some extra light on this dichotomy that I placed here as really characteristic of the present day Central European political structure. So, in Ukraine there was no public interventions on behalf of Black Lives Matter, actually. Just not a single one. There is no demonstrations. The only intervention in the public space was by these guys. It's representatives of Azov battalion. So it's basically the unit which is fighting the war in the east, and they, proud supremacists and nationalists, put this mural in the early June in the embankment of Dnieper River. That's Kyiv. And the map that they put there can repeat. So we can repeat it. Ironically, they're basically repeating what their opponents on the Russian side, it's famous Russian man, можем повторить. We can repeat, but referring to the Second World War and what basically Russians did in 2014 to Americans, as they claiming they repeated what Soviets did to Hitler in 1945. It's just ironic that Ukrainian nationalists basically borrowing subconsciously the same man that supposedly they fight against. And it was not the only one. Like in Kharkiv, so it's in eastern Ukraine, representatives of another battalion that fighting in the east and engaged in street violence at the same time on the streets of Ukrainian cities. So Freikorps, they had their own poster and made a statement about it, that as you see here in Ukraine, the most precious thing are the lives of the citizens of Ukraine. Therefore, our present-day motto is White Lives Matter. It is directed against numerous attempts by the leftists to smuggle incomprehensible and destructive ideas in Ukraine. The irony is there was no leftist demonstrations, and basically the left is non-existent, almost non-existent in Ukraine. There were some memorial laws which made very, very difficult to demonstrate anything related to Soviet past. Any symbols are prohibited, and Communist Party was banned in 2016. So, ironically, the substitution for the absent left in Ukrainian context are LGBT activists. So the red flag turned rainbow. Because in the present-day context, basically this monument is the only surviving Soviet monument in Kyiv, because all the monuments that's legal, just was legally enforced, were removed, and this motherland, homeland mother, Rodina Mать, having the sword and the shield with the Soviet symbols and dominating the panorama over the Dnieper River. So that was intervention by the LGBT community as part of the Kyiv Pride this year, which went online because of the pandemic. And the interesting thing is to what a degree the rightist discourse is hegemonic right at the moment in Ukraine. That this action was supported by a couple of European embassies, Open Society Foundation, and a couple of Ukrainian banks. The LGBT community is getting the protection from the police and from the state, because that's a legitimate, let's say, segment within the European choice that Ukraine made in 2013. And not to have any doubts about the relationship between the Soviet past and LGBT community, because many people in Ukraine who are still keeping the views, let's say, opposing the development that happened since 2013, for them that was inappropriate, because this is a symbol of the victory in the Second World War, and just on the eve of celebrations, commemoration, 22nd of June, this is the beginning of the Great Patriotic War in Soviet Union against Germany. They put this flag there. So the comment of one of the activists who was organizing that was how the symbol under which millions of people were repressed and murdered is less disgusting than the flag under which people are fighting for their rights. So just it's showing to what a degree an LGBT community basically is forced and appropriated by the hegemonic right discourse, which dominating the scene. And what is eventually that's some trend. So actually Maidan turned violent after toppling down the Lenin statue in 2013. So definitely the desire to completely cleanse both memory and public space from symbols related to socialism and Soviet past is evident here. And on the opposite side, the Eastern rebels, secessionists, who, with support of Russia, now engaged in war with government army. So they appropriating Lenin in there one. So that image showing how the Lenin was toppled down by the nationalists, and in Donetsk, in Lugansk, basically here we have incredible mixture of Soviet ideological cliches and symbols, because it's equality, racial and national, demonizing the fascist opponents, which is reappropriated not only to maintain the specific separate identity of the people in eastern Ukraine, but to promote quite nationalist, imperialist aspirations, because that part of quotation, because this guy, he's fighting on the side of the rebels, and his nickname on the battlefield is Black Lenin. So he's telling that Lenin became to symbolize this struggle against Ukrainian fascists, and at the same time, Lenin is perceived as a great Russian man who fought in order to bring back all parts of the disintegrated Russian Empire, turning them into a unified and mighty fist. So I think this bizarre reappropriation of the communist legacy, showing you the polarities at the present moment existing in Ukraine. And major question and challenge at the present moment is definitely for Ukrainian left, and that's something that I would like to talk a little bit. So what the position of Ukrainian left in this conflict? Because part of leftist scene that existed before 2013 basically supported the actions of Eastern rebels as a fight and struggle of the working people against the fascist government in Kyiv, which is definitely not true. To say the least. On the other hand, the leftists who were completely merging with this new hegemonic nationalist discourse and talking about civil society and downplaying the effects that the rise of the right is clearly having on the public life and generally everyday life in Ukraine. The rise of right is quite obvious, and it's supported by the state. And there is the third group, which just decided to keep this move to self-isolation before coronavirus started, partially going underground, partially emigrating, and just taking this self-righteous position, telling that what happened in Ukraine after 2013. It's neoliberal and nationalistic backlash, black and white, and collapsing everything basically along the same fault lines that I was already mentioning. There is socialism opposing to nationalism. There is a history of anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist struggle, which was led clearly by Soviet Union. And supporting this struggle, it's the major task of the left, creating some transnational, global resistance to the present day efforts to challenge existing neoliberal structure. So major culprits are definitely identified here, but I put here that Central European binary is called for mental mapping. Somehow it's reflecting that, because we nicely and neatly putting the accusations of racism, imperialist, colonialism to the first world. And this is a greed and basically imagination that was created during the Cold War. The first world is culprit. The second world is fighting against definitely racism, imperialism, and colonialism. And there is a third world that needs somehow to choose its own way towards the radiant future. And here is my personal experience really coming in. Because for me, I told you that I was not on the left. Before 2013, it was basically hegemonic discourse was some kind of liberal. And I started drifting towards the left because of personal circumstances related to Euromaidan. Because just part of the family was completely rejecting what was happening in Ukraine and using this discourse, this is just fascist. Putsch happening in Kiev, multiple friends with whom I was as well very close. On the contrary, we're coming from the one generation and certain moment, it's post-Soviet moment when everyone was adopting some kind of ironical and melancholic attitude towards any political engagement. We have too much political engagement and ideological commitments during Soviet time, and this time it's time to retreat to small circles of friends, playing guitar, drinking wine, and separating us and them. Definitely all these oligarchs and bad people, they are in the government and they're taking power, making money, and we're creating our own ideal utopia, which is completely separated. And it was fascinating to just observe how the people who shared the same kind of position moved in completely different directions when the explosion of Maidan happened. Some of them appropriated this completely nationalistic discourse. Some of them moved toward this more national liberal position, talking about civilizational choice, joining Europe, and definitely marginalizing and othering the other part that decided not to support Maidan. So I just was left with this family and friendly circles complications, which forced me, and I was not present. I was present in Ukraine during Maidan. I was at the Maidan, but still the distance, because of my constant movings around the globe, I just tried to figure out whether there is some quality, and that some quality which cannot be so easily conceptualized and placed in these neat boxes. Fascists or rebels for the righteous cause. And at that moment, now retrospectively I'm realizing, I started searching for some conceptual tools, not consciously, that would allow me to place both myself with this drifting personal and ideological position towards the left. And at the same time, I understand friends and family without completely marginalizing them and making them relevant. Because I think that some subversive and subaltern, repercussions, they are felt in each of these photos. Both here and here you have some history which is not comprehensible easily and clearly, because I'm a professional historian. Definitely the easiest way for me was to take a historical detour. I tried to go back in past, and with this newly available leftist position, my idea was that something more complicated than this happened, and there are more complex relationships between nationalism and socialism, socialism, racism, socialism, imperialism, socialism and colonialism. And basically that was the inspiration when I started toying with post-colonial theory, and there is some intellectual element in that my engagement. But at the same time, I think it's very important politically, because putting everything in neat boxes creates something similar to that. Because this is a border. You know who is bordered there. We don't know who is bordered there. Any guesses? It's the same statue of Churchill that we're looking at. But my point is that something similar is happening, this conceptual boarding, because there is no Lenin statues in Central Europe. Not soon, probably. In Germany it's possible, not possible in Croatia or in Poland. But this conceptual boarding, I think, happening with the legacies of socialism. And what is in that box? Because there can be Lenin, and someone can write, and the standard accusation, liberal accusation, he's a murderer. You can put the murderer is inside. So just intellectually and politically, there is a moment and necessity. In Ukraine, this is a must, because there is no leftist option open, and there is this polarization and prevalent nationalistic discourse which needs to be addressed. And this question of the national agenda and leftist agenda was constantly urgent for the global left. But then in the early 20th century, Lenin had to address this. And for my determined history meant somehow going and trying to open this box and realized what is there. If there is Lenin statue, we won't find the Lenin, we find this guy. This guy, do you know who this guy is? This is Lenin's father. Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov. And the whole story, this Russian relation, Russian empire, Russian colonial empire, Russian urge since the early 18th century, since Peter the Great, to emulate Western empires, to play the same civilizational mission in this huge, vast territory. And Lenin's father was of peasant background and of mixed ethnic background. It's all these indigenous nations which populated the Volga basin, that's where he's coming from. And upward mobility, not a common story for 19th century or the 19th century, but by appropriating European culture. And in Russia, the distinction between, so the race partially was substituted by cultural distinction. What I mean? The skin immediately reflects the racial difference, at least supposedly. That was before the scientific racism was introduced in the late 19th century, and just one drop of blood immediately disqualified you, let's say, from driving the car in the American South. In Russia, this distance took a different form, cultural form. So first move of Peter the Great was to force his nobility to shave the beards, because all the peasants were carrying the beards, and you immediately could identify this distance. And then they're introducing different languages. First it was German, Swedish, later French language, which again creates the distance. And definitely this Occidental elite, as I call it, totally oriented towards the West, emulating the West, planned to carry the civilizational mission, colonizing mission in its own country. So there is a complex dynamic between internal colonization and external colonization, in which Russian Empire was engaged, and Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov was the product of this specific colonial dynamic. Because ethnically mixed background, he was responsible for preaching the gospel of Christianity and responsible for making the indigenous nations loyal to the empire by preaching to them in their own language. So codification of different languages, Ingushe, Vatyaki, Chuvash. That was his responsibility, and it's something that his son is going to do later. Because he's just preaching not the gospel of Christianity, not turning the pagans into Christians. Lenin tried to use their own language, and that's the core of national politics in the Soviet Union, to open expose them to Marxist discourse, and definitely to raise them to consciousness. What does this imply? Right? Russian Revolution and post-coloniality, was it possible to approach it from that perspective? So Bolsheviks, there were revolutionary radicals who were recruited from the ranks of Russian intelligentsia and from borderland subalterns. If you look at the leadership, Bolshevik leadership, all of them coming from borderlands. Stalin is a peasant who is rising his consciousness, definitely from Georgia. Trotsky is a marginalized Jew from Pale of Settlement, and you can just enumerate on and on. The people from all around the empire are coming and trying to implement this anti-imperial and anti-colonial movement, directed against definitely Russian Empire as a colonial power and against capitalists, because they're strongly anti-capitalist and anti-Western, but at the same time, what they're sharing is profoundly Occidental-centric vision. I mean, they want to get rid of the capitalism, but substituting it with some nice version that was not realized in the West, and definitely the importance of enlightenment and culture, basically, within the Soviet project and Bolshevik project, somehow substituting the presence of the market, overwhelming presence of the market in capitalism. And so national Bolsheviks or Bolshevist leaders of the anti-colonial movements in the peripheries, they eagerly embrace the Bolshevik anti-imperial and anti-capitalist agenda, but much like the Bolshevik leaders in Moscow, their horizon of revolutionary expectations was framed by the imaginary or ideal West, and the construction of socialism implied national variation in cultural revolution, which had to mold new revolutionary and modern subject out of the imperfect material that was inherited from the era of colonialism and imperialism. What does it imply? Turning this guy, Russian peasant, into modern subject. And the key issues that nationalism and communism, so they interrelated, the distinction between nationalism and communism often sounds too artificial. In this context, to achieve communism, and this is Marxist teleology, you need to raise national consciousness in people. So there are certain stages in the ethnic development and development of social forms, which eventually in the end should merge together when the communism is going to be achieved. But before that, you need nationality and ethnicity as a vehicle. Again, we can remember Lenin's father. You need to use the language to make them to believe into the Marxist creed. The backwardness, that's another aspect that is characteristic of this development of anti-imperial, anti-colonial explosion in the semi-peripheral empire as Russia was. So bringing peasants, purging the backwardness and prejudices that persists in their consciousness. And the major technique that the Soviet state and the Bolshevik definitely wanted to imply is not so different from the techniques that other colonial powers are using. The violence, that's a classical technique of the modern state that have to forge the subject in the new type of the new man. And something very different, I would say, from other empires, enlightenment. The stress on the enlightenment, access to culture, and which supposedly had to help these people to make a breakthrough to the future. So that's just illustrations how it played out across the empire. Peasants into Ukrainians or Russians. You see, this is Alexei Stakhanov, so the major, the key protagonist in this movement towards rising the production rates in Soviet Union. But definitely he's transcending the backwardness of his ancestors, Russian peasants. Just to remember, there was clearly colonial and, let's say, racially charged context in Russian case. Here, the nomads, Kazakhs, they had to be turned as well into modern subjects, and that is why they had to become sedentary agriculturalists, using their camels to plow the steppe and raise wheat instead of producing milk. finally, the Jews, another conspicuous marginalized group. They had to transform themselves into Soviets because they didn't get their own national box in the Soviet national edifice. Actually, this is a special school for Jewish orphans who fled the pogroms in Ukraine during the Civil War. And the first person here, maybe someone will recognize him, who worked there as an artist, leading artist, that's Mark Chagall. So basically, the Jews moving from the marginal position in the palace settlement and occupying prominent position in the new center. It's quite important. But I just want to stress this anti-imperial, anti-colonial explosion eventually was used to reproduce new kind of differences and establishing new kind of hierarchies, which were based not on unequal access, let's say, to resources, material or economic exploitation, but rather by unequal access to information and culture that Bolsheviks were obsessed to spread and at the same time were obsessed to control. And this is just famous hierarchy that everyone is, not everyone, someone who's doing Russian history is familiar. So there is certain hierarchy of nations existing. Clearly the first man, it's a Russian proletarian who rise to consciousness, already achieved the truth. And then you have different folkish variants. Ukrainians next, already, they're still not there to turn themselves completely into modern subjects. It's definitely better to switch into Russian. But if not, you can still have your national box and persist in your national identity. And this hierarchy is going down. There is Azeri guys, there is Georgians, and everyone has to move along this path towards towards the future where all the national distinctions are going to be erased. But they persist right at the moment. National in form, but socialist in content. And at the same time, the specific construction of this empire implied that Moscow will turn into a new imperial center with no national distinctions. It was global, proving that socialism in one country is possible. But at the same time, this revolutionary experiment needs to radiate its potency and cultural superiority all around the world. This is a Taplin's monument, that the famous monument that was planned to be built on the top of the House of Unions. Eventually, that was not realized, and they ended up with a pool there after the Second World War. Previously, on that place was a famous cathedral, which was blown up by the Bolsheviks in the early 30s. And famous Stalinist architecture, grandeur, imperial grandeur, and cosmopolitan elite that solidifying these new imperial hierarchies. That's something that I call Occidentalist elite, obsessed with the West and trying to compete and transcend the West at the same time. But don't have time today to go too much into the details about this dynamic between Occidentalists and the building of Soviet empire. I would prefer here switch again back a little bit to this personal narrative, because everything what's happening there is somehow related to my family stories, just squarely related. The stories that I was not aware of, not reflecting too much until recently. So my grandfather, first violence, right? That's the technique to shape everyone into modern. My grandfather was Ukrainian peasant from northern Ukraine, and he experienced personally collectivization, brutal collectivization in the early 30s, and Holodomor. Half of his family died in Holodomor. And at the same time, Soviet power gave him multiple opportunities. If you survived that, you can, it says that knowledge will break the chains of slavery. And definitely this upward mobility was provided. He became a doctor, switched from Ukrainian into Russian. I never heard him talking to me in Ukrainian, but his accent in Russian was quite strong. But he did never that. And at the same time, on top of this clearly colonial practices, but with the aim of creating a new society, fair society. In Ukraine particularly, another colonial project left the imprint. And I'm talking definitely about Nazi and their attempt at racial cleansing during the war. So on your side, on the left, this is a ruins of the small city from where my grandfather originated, this Ukrainian grandfather. It's Koryukivka in Chernihiv, and that was its experience in 1942, the most terrible massacre of civilians in the Second World War. One night, 7,000 people were burned, and again, the casualties in the family. That's one part. So that colonial experience, that living the imprint, because Germans were pursuing their own specific agenda, colonial in Ukraine. On the right side, this is a Holocaust in the East, and that already on my mom's part. I never was aware of Jewish ancestry, but there was some Jewish ancestry. And half of that family was basically perished in Holocaust. It's central Ukraine, Zaporizhia, present day, formerly Alexandrovsk. And for me, just was the major question was, because no one was talking ever about this story. Right? That's something that was covered through, that's something that I remember. So that's normality of Soviet civilization, which eventually delivered on its promises. It's a welfare state, it's a security on the job market, opportunity to get education for free, medical services for free. Definitely it was achieved through violence. And the most, again, enlightenment is present here on the photo. I just want to put the Soviets were very proud, one of the ideological points, but appropriated deeply by the people, the most reading nation in the world. So definitely the market is prohibited, but we can use culture as a medium at the same time. And you see, and the Soviet intelligentsia talking about this culture, hierarchically organized, because there is no much social mobility, not so much mobility in Soviet society. You ascribe to a certain place, and it's very difficult to move. And this Soviet intelligentsia basically is the agent, getting education, getting culture, finally ordering normal life. This is the protagonist of this erasure and oblivion of the history that was lurking behind. And just to give a glimpse of what they tried to do and how it turned out. So you see it here, the Slavic old women, they probably already not thinking too much about the horrors of Soviet collectivization and attempt to make them modern. At least my grandfather never talked about anything like that. The proletariats, right, the workers who as well happy to deliver their communistic labor to the motherland. And if we go back to some more exotic places, like Kazakhstan, clearly colonial context. So those, the heirs of the people who were plowing with the camels, they turned into these nice modern subjects. There is no Jim Crow segregation, interracial marriages, and you see the Kazakhs hanging out in these modern restaurants and simply having fun. So I will just bring, I never visited Kazakhstan. And to bring it closer now to Croatian context, I was born in Uzhgorod. And it just will show the definition of this post-colonial condition as some theoreticians defined it, that is inherently, unevenly distributed around the globe. And so there is multiple hybrid identities are created in the process of colonial expansion of the European powers. And you have different constellation, power constellation, different ways of culturally and economically exploiting territories all around the globe. And I'm just turning to Uzhgorod because I was talking about Soviet colonial project, I was talking about German colonial project with the same idea of remolding cleansing and creating some future in the horizon of the future utopia. So here is Zagreb, right? We have Požega, and I think here somewhere is Osijek. So that's the Hungarian part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so Uzhgorod is here. It's Ungvar in Croatian, the standard city with the fortress from Hungarian kingdom. And Hungarians later in 18th and 19th centuries, they pursuing their own modernizing project. So on the left, you see the Hungarian center. Downtown residence area only for Hungarians and Germans. Surrounded by the Slavic population who are supposed to change definitely and turn themselves ultimately in more cultural Brit. On the right, it's after 1918, Uzhgorod was joined Czechoslovakia. So they were pursuing their own modernizing project as well, built the downtown for the bureaucrats who were coming from Prague. And the same dynamic unfolding. The peasants and the elite that leading them to some modern life. Oh, I'm sorry. After that, the Soviets came to the same territory. My grandfather came to Uzhgorod, was sent as a colonizer. He had to bring the truth of Soviet civilization to the dilapidated and obscure lands of Czechoslovakia. And you see, Soviet modernity is created there. And he, the person who behind himself has all these overlaps of different colonial projects with the imprint that he never was talking about, is supposed to bring this civilization to Ukrainians, because the Ruthenian Slavic population was considered by the Soviets as Ukrainians, and they were given their own infrastructure, national infrastructure. And again, books are very important. So that's the most reading shepherds in the world. So there were the Gutsuls, the sub-ethnic group of Ukrainians living in the Carpathians, Eastern Carpathians. They're reading here Lenin, and definitely it's a photo from 1954. Transcarpathia was annexed by Soviets in 1945. So to bring it slowly to the conclusion, that was kaleidoscopic, very, very fast. Retrospection, I just rewinded very quickly. But I think just what I tried to show here and bring the story to the 1901 back, right? That when the Soviet Union collapsed, and my parents and colonizers, that's that Soviet intelligentsia that I was talking about, appropriating culture, Russian language, sitting on the top of all these hierarchies, and definitely patronizingly looking towards the Hutsuls who tried to master the culture in a Soviet way, but never succeeded to master it completely. That's definitely the position of the colonizer. And the familiar post-imperial story, when everything collapsed, there was just blatant denial there was any colonial dynamic in this context, and I was part of it, because in the 1990s, early 2000s, I was completely not aware of this history, was not interested, and clearly put a lot of effort in order to maintain my own superior identity vis-a-vis indigenous population that lived in Transcarpathia. And so there is a need, going back to this question of facing the socialist past and the opportunities for the left to reconsider this very, very strict division between good and bad. And it's something, very important question for generally inheriting the communist legacy in the 20th century. I think the first circle that happened already in the 1980s was related to the challenge of feminism, which Marxism was not considering serious at all, and it clearly transformed significantly this progressive agenda. The post-colonial perspective, I think it's another way to make just leftist agenda more updated and more relevant to the present moment. Going back to Ukraine, so I think that this colonizing past is the must for the left to admit and somehow to engage intellectually in order to build some ground. I'm not talking about common ground now, because the country is crazily polarized and there is this another nationalist narrative that Soviets were Russian occupiers and we have nothing to do with that. So, in order to be able to counter different liberal interpretations that just putting us in this double opposition, there is Hitler and Stalin and there is no space, only neoliberal consensus that you can choose as the third secure option. So for the left, in Ukraine, this is a both political and intellectual question and challenge. In order to create some space for reconciliation is difficult because now the blood is already was spilled, and I don't think that fast and soon we will be able to bring the country together. But still, the consensus that now existing there, it's very fragile. It can really fall apart, and not having any leftist option available, the domination of the rightist discourse is just incredible. And I'm not telling you that it's possible to bring this immediately, this agenda, of this awareness of the history behind, because the denial of the post-colonial or post-imperial quality of Ukrainian movement, because just to these guys who toppling down Lenin, you can consider them just nationalists and fascists, but the imprint that this colonial experience had on multiple Ukrainians, because if you want to reach this top position in Soviet society, eventually you still need to switch to Russian. If you're persisting in your Ukrainian, you already consider it not normal enough. And at the same time, this interesting dynamic, because Russian is the language of modernity per se. If you're talking Ukrainian, you're inferior culturally, and there is nothing possible in that language that can transcend this backwardness and traditionality and eventually turn towards some modern forms of life. And that is why this folkish culture, I'll show you a picture, that Ukrainians, they always were wearing some embroidered shirts that, to underscore their little bit lower position in these hierarchies. So my point is that reconsidering this past and opening the box with Lenin and trying to figure out what happened, how happened, I think that post-colonial perspective is really opening some new opportunities. And with the next generation coming into being in Ukraine, I think that there are opportunities both to mobilize new generation to reconcile somehow and to come together. And I think for Croatia, seeing the polarization, incredible polarization, that is the present moment is very, very much present, and definitely looking at some Domovinsky populist statement, it's difficult to stay calm and think about more reflective approach to the past. But eventually I think that's some important global task for transnational left, to go back and reconsider the legacies of the communism in the 20th century, which needs to be a building block in the attempt to do something different in this century. So that's it.
Thank you.
Clearly, if you have questions, I think it was very fast and dense. So
thank you, Vladimir. That was really dense and both mix of personal history and these big historical chapters. And let's see if we have some questions from the audience.
Pa i naravno možete pitati na hrvatskom, ja ću govoriti na engleskom.
A koliko ti je bilo teško kada si se teoretski krenuo baviti zapravo sa smještanjem dekolonizirajućeg i postkolonizirajućeg diskursa na teritoriju o kojem sam upravo govorio? Koliko si imao poteškoća uopće objasniti na što misliš? Da li je to nešto samorazumljivo i u sredini u kojoj dolaziš? I da li se to na neki način automatski vezuje za neki možda antikomunistički stav ili tu postoji neki prostor u kome se ta pozicija pregovara?
I mean, that's embrace of post-colonial theory. It's not that I started with post-colonial theory and then moved to my material. I didn't know anything about post-colonial theory, not much. That was more just the tools that were available for me, and material and ideas, and particularly the pressure of the present, of this political context, forced me to look for another language. And this post-colonial, I started reading, and at a certain moment, just everything started coming together. And it's not common position in the field of Soviet studies, so it's something new. Usually, the post-colonial position applied to this exotic context that I showed, like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. But when you're talking about core Russian Slavic territories, Ukraine and Russia, totally different frameworks are applied. So I would say that just was some natural language that I picked up at a certain moment. And at the same time, because the material was so unexpectedly resonating with these theoretical frameworks, it allowed me not to repeat what I found in these theoretical writings about postcoloniality, coming mostly from Indian context or Latin American context, but really to find, and that's the most important question, of the global modernity as uneven and combined. So each piece of this global puzzle, because it's interconnected world, this is certain totality, but each piece will reflect it somehow differently. So basically each region, it's not that you're going and studying Yugoslav history or Soviet history and you need to confirm certain theory coming from the Western context. That's a classical example of modernization theory and this Cold War mentality. And the First World is preoccupied with philosophy and social theory, providing the tools, and the Second World is mostly studied by political science. It's all about totalitarianism and structures of Soviet power, and the Third World is anthropology and economics. So this division of labor, disciplinary, was basically projected on the political map of the world. So for me, and I think I'm still working on this because it's not a finished project, but that each part, and that's awareness, that even coming from the local context, supposedly relevant to some global discussions, with postcolonial perspective, you really can see something interesting, new, unique, and at the same time not to keep it as local, but eventually integrate in some broader framework. The other question that you asked is about that this critical engagement with the communist past. It may sound too revisionist and eventually gearing towards anti-communist position. But these anti-communist positions, they're clearly available. And I think the problem with more engaged leftist positions that they're not trying to engage them. It's usually just denial, what we can do. They're talking again about Stalin and Hitler, the classical position of Timothy Snyder, maybe you heard about his bloodlines, that exactly about Ukraine and about overlap of two projects, colonial, Stalin's project and Hitler's project. My point is that really to engage and be open and able to react in some updated way, you need to keep these two blocks and eventually still bring them back into some global story or world history. Because you cannot talk about Hitler, Stalin without bringing that other part which is now becoming more and more scrutinized. I'm talking the First World, Churchill, and reconsideration of that past. So I think we're just moving to some kind of new historical narrative that just needs to be reworked and developed for the needs of the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, what was for me interesting there is, and you were making this point, maybe not so explicitly, is that viewing like nationalism in opposition to socialism becomes a little bit less convincing when you see how much the socialist project, both in the USSR and in Yugoslavia, mobilized and actually used nationalism to get people to embrace socialism, right? So these peasants who did not actually have a national identity, right? They were just peasants. They were being convinced that they are Ukrainians and that they had to become, one of these nations. And I think, you know, in the Soviet Union, I was surprised when I learned that it was even more sort of brutal than in Yugoslavia, in the sense of these national divisions. For example, in the Soviet Union, people, even if they were of like so-called mixed marriages, like let's say your mother is Russian, your father is Georgian, in your passport you had to explicitly identify, you had to choose what you are, right? You had to say I'm Georgian or I'm Russian. Whereas in Yugoslavia you didn't have to, or you had eventually this position Yugoslav that was able then to embrace, or at least also in your passport it wasn't written, you know, you didn't have to declare what you were. And also what I found an interesting parallel is with the Jews, because you said because the Jews were not considered, they could not be, you know, molded into a nation, they then became these modern Soviet subjects and on the frontier of culture. And maybe in the Yugoslav context this would be somehow the position of Muslims for a while, right? Who couldn't, you know, like, they were not, they were Slavs, right, but they were not Christians, so, you know, they were occupying this, in the beginning they did not have a nation, they only got the right to declare themselves as one of these Yugoslav nations and nationalities in '68, I think. So, I mean, it's just interesting to think about, you know, this fact that actually nationalism was useful for the building of the socialist project, and somehow it consolidated these nations in Yugoslavia by definitely organizing the entire structure in the sense of socialist republics that largely corresponded with the national identity. And of course they did that because they wanted to show the difference with the previous interwar Yugoslav state, which was explicitly imperialist and oppressive of certain, especially certain national identities. So you know, this is also the contradiction, right? That you cannot just say that nationalism is just explicit, it just comes out of nowhere. You know, it does come to a large extent from the way that these peasants were turned into socialists via nationalism.
Yeah, that's a vehicle. That's for sure a vehicle. And my point is that nationalism provides both emotions and energy to build socialism. That's clear in the Soviet case. And the point for the present day, it's not enough just to put nationalism in a separate box. You need to engage, and there is still potential somehow to engage in it. I'm not telling you to embrace Miroslav Škoro or to say that Hadizeh is fine. But in Ukraine, it's clearly with the presence and strong presence of this nationalistic discourse, the left again, that's the challenge that the left had in the early 20th century when they wanted to use these peasants and eventually transformed it in modern socialist subject. There were national Bolsheviks, and I mentioned that everywhere, from Kazakhstan to Ukraine. It's nomads who want to participate in this movement, and at the same time to affirm their national identity. So without addressing this national question, let's say, in Ukraine, without advancing comprehensible position from the left, there is no option for the left right at the moment. You need somehow to engage. And I'm just showing that through this historical detour, you can go back and see how differently you can talk about nation, oppression, colonial distinctions, and relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Without this reconsideration, it's just impossible to be present now in political spectrum, without the need to cave in and make any compromises with present-day nationalistic discourse there. I don't know what is going on in Croatia, but I think there is still potential to get some electoral strengthening from the current incredible support for the right. And I think there needs to be some switch in the way you as well talking about socialist past.
Do you see that the field of art or culture in Ukraine can in any case contribute to that?
I mean, I hope so, but it's just in the present moment the institutional framework is defining so much. And in Kiev, this cultural center that they're running, and it was like kind of leftist, but there was like huge split on the left. And artists definitely all participating in these debates and discussion. I would say that mainstream art, which is institutionalized, it's to a certain degree embracing this nationalistic status quo that I'm talking about. They're definitely criticizing the supremacists and radical right, but they're not trying basically to approach Ukrainians from the other side, or at least to think about the complexity of this relationship that existing now between these separatists, which are completely not present in the public discourse in Ukraine. They consider it to be backward. You know, the same discourse, enlightenment discourse. They backward, they Soviets. So just 100 years ago, Soviet was progressive and stand for brilliant future, and now Soviet stands within the progressive narrative, liberal narrative for backwardness and ability to adjust to the challenges of the modern life. I think it's not much fun to adjust to the challenges of this modern life. And all the think tanks, IT clusters that now you have in Ukraine, so who think about themselves as a modern engine of change, moving into this postmodernist, post-industrial future, they just considering these people as surplus that you can just get rid of. Completely, it can be called racist as well. So this distance is just created in a different way. I don't know what's happening now actually in the East, and it's another, in Lugansk and Donetsk, because they had their own splits. There are people who, misplaced persons who left Lugansk and Donetsk, came to Kiev, went to Kharkov, Lviv, and they just now reproducing very, very angry hate discourse toward their compatriots. I don't know, I'm not so familiar with the scene in Ukraine, but I think art, as usual, have a huge potential because you can start talking about these issues using completely different media, because for me it's very personal story, and I'm trying to articulate it in a certain way using tools available to me. And for sure, artists can do it in a different way, and there is a space for collaboration. And I hope it will happen at some point.
To je sve za večeras. Hvala. Vladimir, hvala na ovom putovanju. U isto vrijeme osobnom i angažiranom i vrlo hrabrom istupu tu s nama u Zagrebu.
Hvala vama, super je bilo.